Texas, 1873. The unforgiving sun beat down on the dusty streets of Sweetwater, a frontier town caught between civilization and wilderness. The war had been over for 8 years, but its ghost still haunted the land. For some, like Elias Kincaid, the frontier offered something the East could never provide, a chance to disappear into vast, empty spaces where a man could outrun his past. Elias dismounted his chestnut gelding outside the general store, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the weathered boardwalk. At 25, his face still held the smoothness of youth, though his hazel eyes carried the weight of experiences beyond his years. His clean-shaven jaw clenched slightly as he secured his horse to the hitching post, adjusting the worn Stetson that shaded his sun-bronzed features. "Another dry season coming," remarked old Turner from his rocking chair on the porch. "Cattle won't make it without water." "They will on the Circle K," Elias replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived worse than drought. "We always find a way." But behind that assurance lay the belief that had guided him since the day he'd ridden west. A real cowboy stood alone. The frontier was no place for attachments. Men who opened their hearts on the range inevitably lost them to outlaws' bullets, disease, or the crushing disappointment when those they loved couldn't endure the harshness of frontier life. Elias had witnessed it all too often: strong men broken by loss, ranches abandoned because a wife couldn't bear another winter, children left fatherless by senseless violence. What Elias wanted was simple: to build the Circle K into the finest cattle ranch in West Texas, to earn enough respect that people forgot to ask about his past, and to do it all relying on no one but himself. What he needed, though he'd never admit it, was to stop running, to find someone who made the endless prairie feel like home instead of just another place to hide. Inside the general store, Lillian Kelly stood behind the counter, her slender fingers arranging a display of hair ribbons with methodical precision. At 22, she possessed a quiet beauty that she took pains to downplay, her honey-blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her blue calico dress plain and practical with none of the fashionable frills other young women favored. Her deep blue eyes rarely met those of customers, especially not the young cowboys who occasionally attempted conversation. "Miss Kelly," Mrs. Henderson said, approaching the counter with a basket of supplies, "you've organized those ribbons 3 times today. Anyone would think you're avoiding something." Lillian's fair cheeks colored slightly. "Just trying to keep busy, ma'am." "Or keeping your distance from that handsome Kincaid boy I saw heading this way," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing smile. "He's been in town 2 months now, buying that old Wilson place, and I've noticed you practically disappear whenever he comes in." "I don't know what you mean," Lillian replied, though her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her already immaculate apron. The truth Lillian guarded fiercely was etched into her very soul: she was fundamentally unlovable. Her father had made that clear enough before abandoning her mother and her when she was just 12. Her mother had reinforced it with every bitter complaint about the burden of raising a child alone. And Thomas Burke, the banker's son who had courted her briefly 2 years ago, had proven it beyond doubt when he'd laughed with his friends about how easily manipulated the plain, desperate shopgirl had been. The bell above the door jangled, and Lillian instinctively stepped back into the shadow of the shelving as Elias Kincaid entered, bringing with him the scent of leather, horse, and open prairie. "Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," he nodded politely before his gaze swept the store and landed briefly on Lillian. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps curiosity, before he turned his attention to the list in his hand. Lillian busied herself with inventory, keeping her back to the main room. She needed this job desperately. It was all that stood between her and complete destitution since her mother's death last winter. She couldn't afford distraction, especially not in the form of a cowboy with eyes that seemed to see too much. What neither knew as they carefully orbited each other in the close confines of the general store was that the wheel of fate was already turning, about to throw them together in a way that would challenge everything they believed about themselves and each other. 3 days later, a spring thunderstorm broke the drought with spectacular violence. Lightning split the sky as Lillian hurried along the muddy road toward her small rented room at the edge of town. Her arms were laden with books from the lending library, her one indulgence, stories of far-off places and lives far different from her own. The creek that usually trickled lazily between town and her lodgings had swollen to a raging torrent. Lillian stood at its edge, dismayed. The narrow footbridge had been washed away, leaving no way to cross safely. As rain soaked through her thin shawl, she contemplated returning to town to seek shelter when the sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. "Miss Kelly." She turned to find Elias Kincaid astride his horse, his duster gleaming with rain. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said, surveying the rushing water with a frown. "That creek's only going to rise higher." "I need to get home," she replied, clutching her books tighter to her chest. "Mrs. Patterson will lock the doors at dark." Without hesitation, Elias extended his hand. "I'll get you across." Lillian stared at his outstretched hand, reluctance warring with necessity. "I wouldn't want to trouble you, Mr. Kincaid." "It's no trouble," he said simply. "But those books won't survive if you stay out here much longer." She looked down at her precious volumes, already dampening at the edges, and made her decision. With awkward dignity, she accepted his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him. "Hold on," he instructed, and she hesitantly placed her hands at his waist, maintaining as much distance as possible while still keeping her seat. The horse splashed through the swollen creek, water reaching its belly as it fought against the current. For one terrifying moment, Lillian felt the animal lose its footing, and she instinctively tightened her grip, pressing against Elias' back. His solid warmth contrasted sharply with the cold rain, and she felt rather than heard his quiet words of encouragement to the horse. They emerged safely on the other side, and Elias didn't stop until they reached the small boarding house where Lillian rented a room. Only then did she realize her cheek had been pressed against his back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. "I thank you," she stammered, sliding awkwardly to the ground, her books clutched against her chest like a shield. "Let me see you to the door," he said, dismounting and tying his horse to the porch rail. "There's no need." "My mother would haunt me if I left a lady standing in the rain," he interrupted with the ghost of a smile. "Besides, looks like you could use help with those books." Before she could protest further, he gently took the stack from her arms, leaving her no choice but to lead the way to the boarding house door. On the covered porch, she turned to reclaim her books, finally meeting his eyes directly. "You're new to Sweetwater," she said, immediately regretting the obvious statement. "Been here 2 months," he replied. "Bought the old Wilson Ranch west of town, Circle K I'm calling it." "That's a lot of work for one man." "Hired a couple of hands," he said with a shrug, "but yes, it's a lot of work, that's the point." Something in his tone resonated with her, the deliberate seeking of labor to fill empty spaces. She recognized it because she did the same, organizing ribbons 3 times over rather than facing quiet evenings alone. "Well," she said, taking her books back, "thank you again, Mr. Kincaid." "Elias," he corrected, "and you're welcome, Miss Kelly." "Lillian," she offered in return, surprising herself. He nodded once, then turned back to his horse, mounting with fluid grace. "Stay dry, Lillian," he said, and then he was gone, galloping back into the storm. Lillian stood watching until he disappeared into the gray curtain of rain, a strange feeling settling in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude, it was the unsettling sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The storm marked a turning point, though neither would have admitted it. Elias found reasons to visit town more frequently, his trips to the general store coinciding with Lillian's shifts. Their conversations remained brief, polite, yet each carried away small details about the other like treasured tokens. She learned he'd come from Tennessee, that he'd fought briefly in the war despite his youth, that he preferred coffee black and strong enough to stand a spoon in. He discovered her love of books, her knack for mathematics that made her invaluable to the storekeeper, her quiet devotion to the 3 orphaned Martin children who lived at the church mission. 2 weeks after the storm, Elias entered the store to find Lillian alone, frantically trying to organize a toppled display of canned goods. "Mr. Winslow will be back any minute," she explained, her usually composed demeanor frayed with worry. "If he sees this mess." Without a word, Elias removed his hat and knelt beside her, his capable hands gathering scattered tins. "What happened?" he asked quietly as they worked. "Drunken cowboys," she replied tersely. "Thought it would be amusing to see how I'd react." His jaw tightened. "Who were they?" "It doesn't matter," she said, though her hands trembled slightly. "It happens sometimes." It shouldn't. They worked in silence until the display was restored, and Elias rose to his feet just as the storekeeper returned. Mr. Winslow eyed them suspiciously, his gaze lingering on Lillian's flushed cheeks. I was just helping Miss Kelly with an inventory question, Elias explained smoothly. She's quite thorough with your accounts. Later, as Lillian wrapped his purchases in brown paper, she murmured, "You didn't have to lie for me." "Not a lie," he replied. "You are thorough, I've noticed." "You've noticed me?" The words escaped before she could stop them. His eyes, warm and direct, held hers for a moment too long. "Yes, Lillian, I have." 3 days later, disaster struck the Circle K. A midnight lightning strike set the barn ablaze, and by the time Elias and his two ranch hands contained the fire, half his hay store was gone, along with 2 horses and most of his tools. The news traveled quickly to town, and Lillian found herself gathering supplies, salve for burns, bandages, coffee, and food, before she'd fully formed the thought of bringing them out to the ranch. She borrowed the storekeeper's wagon and made the 5-mile journey with her heart in her throat, questioning her impulsiveness with every turn of the wheels. When she arrived, the acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. Elias emerged from the charred remains of the barn, his face streaked with soot, his expression transforming from weariness to surprise at the sight of her. "Lillian, what are you doing here?" She stood awkwardly beside the wagon. "I heard about the fire. I brought some supplies, if you need them." For a moment, he simply stared at her, and she felt her cheeks flame with embarrassment. Of course he didn't need her help. What had she been thinking? "I should go," she began, turning back toward the wagon. "No," he said quickly, "please stay. We could use the help and the company." She spent the day at the Circle K, cleaning burns, preparing food, helping salvage what could be saved from the barn. As evening approached, she found herself sitting beside Elias on his porch steps, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for today, for seeing what needed doing and doing it." "It wasn't much." "It was everything," he countered. "Most people in town still see me as an outsider." "You're the first person who's treated me like," he trailed off. "Like what?" "Like I belong here." The simple statement hung between them, weighted with meaning. Lillian stared at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I should get back before dark," she said finally. "I'll ride with you," he offered immediately. "The road can be dangerous after sunset." They rode in comfortable silence, the wagon creaking rhythmically beneath them. As they approached town, Elias cleared his throat. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wondered if you might consider attending with me." Lillian's heart lurched painfully in her chest. A social meant dancing, conversation, being seen together publicly. It meant expectations she couldn't possibly fulfill. "I don't think that would be wise," she replied softly. "Because you don't enjoy dancing." "Because I'm not what you think I am," she said, the words emerging more sharply than intended. "I'm not, I don't." She took a steadying breath. "People will talk if you're seen with the shop girl." Elias turned to look at her directly, his expression serious in the fading light. "Let them talk. I don't care what people think. I care what you think." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me understand," he said gently. "Because from where I'm sitting, I see a woman of remarkable courage and kindness who, for some reason, believes she doesn't deserve happiness." His perception cut too close to the bone, and Lillian felt exposed in a way that terrified her. They had reached the edge of town, and she seized the opportunity to end the conversation. "Thank you for escorting me," she said formally. "I can manage from here." Elias looked as though he wanted to say more but finally nodded, respecting her withdrawal. "The invitation stands," he said simply before turning his horse and riding back toward his ranch, leaving Lillian with the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, someone had seen through her carefully constructed walls. The church social arrived, and despite her resolve, Lillian found herself standing before her small mirror, pinning up her hair with more care than usual. She wore her best dress, a modest blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and allowed herself a single drop of her treasured rose water. "This is foolishness," she told her reflection. "He won't even be there." But when she entered the churchyard, her eyes immediately found Elias standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, his tall frame uncomfortable in Sunday clothes, his gaze scanning the crowd until it locked with hers. The smile that transformed his features sent a shock of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. He crossed to her, hat in hand. "You came." "I always attend church functions," she replied, though they both knew it for the evasion it was. "May I get you some punch?" The evening unfolded like a dream, punch and cake at the refreshment table, stilted conversation giving way to genuine laughter, and finally, inevitably, dancing. Elias' hand at her waist was respectful but firm, guiding her through a Virginia reel with unexpected grace. "Where did a rancher learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless after a particularly lively turn. "My mother," he replied, a shadow of old grief crossing his features. "She insisted her sons would be gentlemen, war or no war." As the night deepened and lanterns cast golden pools of light across the churchyard, they found themselves walking along the creek path, far enough from the social to speak privately but close enough to maintain propriety. "You're different tonight," Elias observed, "more yourself somehow." Lillian smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm not entirely sure who that is anymore." "I think you know exactly who you are," he countered. "You just don't believe anyone else will value what you see." His perception silenced her. They walked a few more steps before he spoke again, his voice quiet but determined. "I'm not good with words, Lillian. But I want you to know that I see you, truly see you, and what I see is extraordinary." She stopped walking, her heart hammering painfully. "You can't possibly mean that." "Why not?" "Because men like you don't notice women like me," she said with painful honesty. "Not really, not for long." Elias studied her face in the moonlight, his expression solemn. "What happened to make you believe that?" The direct question broke something loose inside her. Before she could reconsider, she was telling him everything: her father's abandonment, her mother's bitter resentment, Thomas Burke's cruel deception. The words poured out, years of carefully guarded pain finally finding voice. When she finished, they stood in silence beside the murmuring creek. Lillian felt hollowed out, certain she had just destroyed whatever tenuous connection had been forming between them. "I apologize," she said stiffly. "I shouldn't have burdened you with all that." "Don't apologize for trusting me with your truth," Elias replied, his voice rough with emotion. "And don't apologize for the wrongs others have done to you." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his hazel eyes. "Lillian, I was 17 when I rode to war, 19 when I came home to find my family farm burned and my parents dead from fever. I've spent 6 years believing the only way to survive is to need no one." His voice dropped lower. "But seeing you, knowing you, makes me question everything I thought I knew about strength and survival." Before she could respond, voices approached along the path, other couples returning to the social, and the moment shattered. They walked back in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. As summer ripened into fall, Sweetwater witnessed the cautious courtship of Elias Kincaid and Lillian Kelly. He escorted her to church each Sunday, brought wildflowers to the store on Wednesdays, and found reasons to linger in town until her shift ended. She, in turn, began to anticipate his visits, to smile more readily, to speak with greater confidence. For Lillian, each gesture of Elias' attention chipped away at her belief in her own unworthiness. For Elias, each moment in Lillian's company challenged his conviction that isolation was the only safe path on the frontier. On a crisp October afternoon, Elias invited Lillian to see the Circle K. The barn had been rebuilt, the fall roundup completed successfully, and for the first time he felt pride in showing someone what he'd accomplished. "It's beautiful," Lillian said sincerely as they stood on the porch overlooking rolling pastureland dotted with fat cattle. The ranch house itself was modest but solid: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, a sitting room with actual glass windows. "You've done so much in such a short time." "Too much alone," he admitted, watching her face. "I'm starting to think a home needs more than just walls and a roof." The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to grasp it fully. They ate supper at his kitchen table, a simple meal of beef stew and biscuits that Elias had prepared himself. Afterward, he showed her his small library, books inherited from his parents, carefully transported across half a continent. You can borrow any of them, he offered, watching her trail her fingers lovingly across the spines. Thank you, she said softly, for sharing this with me. I want to share everything with you, he replied, the words emerging before he could consider their weight. Lillian turned to face him, her blue eyes wide with surprise and something like hope. Elias. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then, with gentle deliberation, Elias closed the distance between them and kissed her, a tentative question rather than a demand. After an instant of shock, Lillian responded, her hands coming up to rest lightly on his shoulders. When they broke apart, both were breathing unevenly, faces flushed with more than just the heat from the fireplace. I should take you back to town, Elias said regretfully, acutely aware of how quickly propriety could be compromised. The ride back was filled with a new awareness, a sense of crossing a threshold from which neither could return. At her boarding house door, Elias took her hand. I'd like to continue calling on you, he said formally, with honorable intentions. Lillian's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a radiance that caught Elias' breath. I would like that very much, she replied. As winter settled over the Texas plains, their courtship deepened. Elias joined Lillian in her work with the orphaned Martin children, teaching the boys to ride and helping the youngest girl overcome her fear of horses. Lillian helped Elias plan improvements to the ranch house, suggesting practical touches that would make it more comfortable. In town, people began to speak of them as a couple, their initial surprise giving way to acceptance. Even Mr. Winslow, protective of his best employee, grudgingly approved when Elias formally asked permission to court Lillian. Christmas approached, bringing with it a rare snowfall that transformed Sweetwater into a winter wonderland. The church organized a special celebration for the children at the mission, complete with gifts and a Christmas tree. Elias and Lillian worked together, wrapping simple presents, warm mittens, candy sticks, wooden toys carved by some of the town's men. You're good with them, Elias observed as Lillian helped 6-year-old Sarah Martin try on her new mittens. The children, I mean. They're easy to love, she replied. They haven't learned to hide their hearts yet. Unlike some adults I know, he said with gentle teasing. She smiled ruefully. I'm learning slowly. Later that evening, walking back from the church celebration, snowflakes drifting lazily around them, Elias stopped beneath the town's single street lamp. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Merry Christmas, he said, offering it to Lillian. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Elias, it's beautiful, she breathed. Open it, he urged. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents on their wedding day, a photograph she had thought lost when her mother sold most of their possessions during her final illness. How did you find this? She asked, tears gathering in her eyes. Mr. Winslow mentioned your mother had sold some items to Mrs. Henderson before she passed. I tracked down what I could. His expression grew serious. I wanted you to have something to remind you that you came from love, whatever happened after. Lillian's careful composure crumbled at his words. The tears she had held back for so long through her father's abandonment, her mother's death, years of loneliness, finally broke free. Elias held her against his chest, his arms strong around her shoulders, unmindful of the snow or potential onlookers. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I love you, Lillian Kelly, and I want to spend my life showing you just how lovable you truly are. She pulled back to look at his face, her own wet with tears but illuminated with a joy she had never expected to feel. I love you too, she said, even though it terrifies me. Being terrified together is better than being brave alone, he replied, and sealed the truth of it with a kiss that promised a future neither had dared to imagine. The new year brought changes to Sweetwater. A railroad spur line was approved, promising to connect the small town more directly to markets in the east. With increased commerce on the horizon, property values rose, and speculators began arriving to capitalize on the anticipated boom. Among them was Thomas Burke, returned to his father's bank with new ambitions and old arrogance. His first encounter with Lillian occurred at the general store, where he swaggered in as if the 2 years since his departure had never passed. Well, well, he drawled, leaning against the counter where she worked. If it isn't little Lillian still behind the same counter, some things never change, do they? Lillian met his gaze steadily, surprising herself with her lack of reaction to the man who had once devastated her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Burke. How may I help you today?" Her composure clearly irritated him. "I hear you've caught yourself a cowboy," he said with a sneer. "Poor fellow probably doesn't know what he's getting." Before Lillian could respond, the bell above the door jangled and Elias entered. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the scene: Thomas's proprietary posture, Lillian's straight spine and lifted chin. "Everything all right, Lillian?" he asked, crossing to stand beside her. "Perfectly fine," she replied. "Mr. Burke was just leaving." Thomas straightened, sizing up Elias with a banker's calculating eye. "Actually, I was hoping to discuss business. I understand you own the Circle K ranch." "I do," Elias confirmed coolly. "My bank is interested in properties that might benefit from the coming railroad. Yours is well positioned." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We could make you a very generous offer." "Not interested," Elias replied flatly. Thomas's smile tightened. "You might want to consider carefully before refusing. The railroad will change everything around here. Some will prosper, others," his gaze slid meaningfully to Lillian, "others will be left behind." Elias stepped forward, his posture subtly shifting from casual to alert. "I believe the lady asked you to leave." A tense moment passed before Thomas shrugged elaborately. "Think about my offer, Kincaid. I'll be in town for a while." With a mocking tip of his hat to Lillian, he sauntered out. "Who was that?" Elias asked once the door closed. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she rearranged items on the counter. "Thomas Burke, the banker's son." Understanding dawned in Elias' eyes. "The one who?" She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes." Elias' jaw tightened. "Did he threaten you just now?" "Not exactly," she hesitated. "But I don't think he's here just for railroad business. His father still owns the note on this building and on my boarding house." "He can't hurt you anymore," Elias said firmly. "I won't let him." But as January turned to February, Thomas Burke's presence in Sweetwater cast an increasingly dark shadow. Rumors circulated that the bank was calling in loans, that certain businesses might be foreclosed upon to make way for railroad-related development. Mr. Winslow grew increasingly agitated as he received formal notices demanding immediate payment of debts he'd thought were being handled through regular installments. One evening in late February, Elias arrived at Lillian's boarding house to find her sitting on the porch swing, her face pale with worry. "What's happened?" he asked, immediately alert to her distress. "Mrs. Patterson received notice today," she said quietly. "The bank is foreclosing on the boarding house. We all have 30 days to find new accommodations." Elias sat beside her, taking her cold hands in his. "This is Burke's doing. He came to see me today," she admitted. "Offered to help me find a new place to stay in exchange for convincing you to sell the Circle K." Elias' expression darkened. "What exactly does he want with my land?" "He claims the railroad spur will eventually extend right through your property, that you're sitting on land that will be worth 10 times its current value within a year. And he wants to be the one to profit from it," Elias concluded grimly. "Not me." "He's trying to force your hand through me," Lillian said, her voice tight with anger and humiliation. "He thinks you'll sell to protect me." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Maybe we should give him what he wants," he said finally. Lillian's head snapped up. "What?" "Not the ranch," Elias clarified quickly, "but he's right about one thing. I would do anything to protect you." He took a deep breath. "Lillian, I've been waiting for the right moment to ask this, but it seems like now is the time. Will you marry me? Come live at the Circle K as my wife." The proposal, so different from the romantic scenario she might have imagined, nevertheless filled Lillian's heart with a fierce joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Relief and love transformed Elias' face. "We'll announce it at church on Sunday," he said, "and we'll make it clear to everyone, especially Burke, that you're under my protection now." The announcement of their engagement sent ripples through Sweetwater society. Most reactions were positive. Elias had proven himself a responsible rancher, and Lillian was well respected for her work with the orphans and her quiet competence at the general store. But Thomas Burke's response was swift and vindictive. 2 days after the announcement, Mr. Winslow reluctantly informed Lillian that he could no longer employ her. The bank had called in his loan, and he had to reduce expenses immediately. That same day, 3 of the businesses that had regularly ordered beef from the Circle K canceled their contracts, citing financial pressures. "He's trying to destroy us both," Lillian said that evening as she and Elias sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in defiant shades of glory. "He'll fail," Elias replied with quiet certainty. "The ranch is paid for, I have savings, and I've written to my brother in Tennessee, he's a lawyer now. He's looking into whether Burke's actions constitute illegal interference with business." Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steadiness. "I never thought someone could still hate me so much after all this time." "It's not about you," Elias said gently. "It's about power. He couldn't control you then, and he can't control you now. That's what he can't stand." The weeks leading up to their wedding became a battlefield of small victories and defeats. The church mission offered Lillian temporary housing after the boarding house closed. Elias found new buyers for his cattle in neighboring towns. Thomas Burke continued his campaign of pressure, but with each attack, the couple found new reserves of strength in each other and unexpected allies in the community. Mrs. Henderson organized a sewing circle to prepare Lillian's trousseau. The blacksmith refused to do business with the bank after learning of Burke's tactics. Even Mr. Winslow, despite his financial troubles, offered to host the wedding reception at the general store. The wedding itself was scheduled for the first Saturday in April, a time of renewal and promise. The night before, Elias rode into town for the traditional separation before the ceremony, planning to stay at the hotel. He never arrived. When Elias failed to appear for their wedding, Lillian knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Against the concerned protests of the church ladies helping her prepare, she hitched a wagon and drove herself to the Circle K, her wedding dress carefully packed away, her heart pounding with fear. The ranch was eerily quiet when she arrived. No smoke rose from the chimney, no ranch hands called greetings. The front door stood partially open, swinging gently in the spring breeze. "Elias," she called, her voice echoing in the empty yard. Inside, the ranch house had been ransacked, furniture overturned, Elias' precious books scattered across the floor. A smear of blood on the kitchen table sent ice through Lillian's veins. On the table lay a note, the handwriting immediately recognizable. "Miss Kelly, your cowboy refused to be reasonable. He's being held until he signs over his deed. Come alone to the old Sanderson mine if you want to see him alive again. Taipei." Lillian stood frozen, the note trembling in her hand. Her first instinct was to ride for the sheriff, but reason intervened. The Sanderson mine was a good 3 hours from town. By the time help arrived, anything could happen. And if Burke saw a posse approaching, with grim determination, she searched the house until she found what she needed: Elias' spare revolver, a canteen of water, and a small medical kit he kept for emergencies. She had never fired a gun, but Elias had shown her the basics once, concerned for her safety when she was alone. The Sanderson mine lay abandoned in the foothills northwest of town, a failed silver venture that had been deserted for years. As Lillian approached on horseback, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. She had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left. She tethered her horse in a copse of trees some distance from the mine entrance and proceeded on foot, the revolver heavy in the pocket of her riding skirt. As she neared the weathered timbers marking the mine shaft, she heard voices, Thomas Burke and another man she didn't recognize. "He's not going to sign, boss," the second man was saying. "Not even after that beating." "He'll sign when he sees her," Burke replied with chilling confidence. "He'll do anything to protect her, that's his weakness." Lillian's blood ran cold. Carefully, she edged closer to the mine entrance, trying to glimpse inside without being seen. In the shadowy interior, she could make out 3 figures, Burke standing near the entrance, his hired man a few feet away, and Elias slumped against the far wall, his hands bound behind him, his face bloody. Her first instinct was to rush to him, but she forced herself to think clearly. 3 against 1 were impossible odds, she needed to even them somehow. Retreating silently, she circled around to the back of the hillside where a ventilation shaft for the mine emerged, a feature she remembered from childhood stories about the failed mine. The shaft was narrow but navigable, and Lillian lowered herself into it with grim determination, the revolver secured in her pocket. The descent was harrowing, loose rocks threatened to give way beneath her feet, and twice she nearly lost her grip on the ancient timber supports. But finally she emerged into a back tunnel of the mine, the sounds of conversation guiding her forward. "She should have been here by now," Burke was saying, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Maybe she didn't get your note," the hired man suggested, "or maybe she went for the sheriff instead." "She wouldn't risk his life," Burke replied confidently. "She's too soft-hearted for that." "Like hell she is," Elias rasped, his voice rough with pain but undimmed in spirit. "You never knew the first thing about her, Burke." The sound of a blow echoed through the mine, followed by Elias' grunt of pain. Lillian bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, forcing herself to stick to her plan rather than rushing forward. Carefully, she positioned herself behind a stack of abandoned mining equipment, gaining a clear view of the scene without exposing herself. Elias was now on his knees, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Burke stood over him, a pistol held casually in one hand. The hired man lounged against the wall, looking bored. Taking a deep breath, Lillian called out, "Let him go, Thomas." All three men jerked toward the sound of her voice, Burke whirling with his pistol raised. "Come out where I can see you, Lillian," he demanded. "First let Elias go," she countered, keeping her position concealed. Burke laughed, the sound harsh in the enclosed space. "You're not in a position to make demands. Come out now, or I put a bullet in your cowboy." "If you do that, you'll never get what you want," Lillian replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The deed to the Circle K is in his name alone. If he dies, it goes to his brother in Tennessee. You get nothing." A tense silence followed her logic, then Burke gestured to his man, "Find her." As the hired gun moved toward her hiding place, Lillian stepped into view, Elias' revolver held steadily before her with both hands. "I said let him go," she repeated. Burke stared at her in disbelief, then laughed again. "You won't shoot me, Lillian, you don't have it in you." "You're right," she agreed calmly. "I won't shoot you unless you force me to." She shifted her aim slightly, pointing the gun at the support beam beside Burke's head, and fired. The report was deafening in the confined space. Splinters flew as the bullet struck the wooden support, and a shower of dirt and small stones cascaded from the ceiling. All three men instinctively ducked. "The next one brings down the whole shaft," Lillian said with more confidence than she felt. "These supports are rotted through, one more bullet in the right place and we all get buried." She turned to the hired man. "How much is he paying you? Is it worth dying for?" The man glanced nervously at the ceiling, then at Burke. "You didn't say nothing about cave-ins, boss." "She's bluffing," Burke snapped, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Lillian fired again, this time at a support beam near the entrance. More debris rained down, and a low, ominous creaking sound emanated from the tunnel ceiling. "Next one brings it all down," she said quietly. "Untie Elias and back away, or we all die here." The hired man had heard enough. He dropped his gun and bolted for the entrance, disappearing into the fading daylight outside. Burke stood his ground, rage contorting his features as he trained his pistol on Elias' head. "You've ruined everything," he snarled at Lillian. "Again." "No, Thomas," she replied steadily. "You did that yourself." For a moment they were locked in a deadly triangle, Burke's gun on Elias, Lillian's on the critical support beam, Elias struggling against his bonds with renewed determination. The impasse broke when a voice called from outside, "Hello, the mine, Sheriff Hollister here." Burke's focus wavered for a crucial instant. In that moment, Elias lurched sideways, throwing himself at Burke's legs despite his bound hands. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the dirt floor. Lillian rushed forward, keeping her revolver trained on Burke as she called back, "In here, Sheriff. We need help." What followed was a blur of activity, the sheriff and two deputies securing Burke, a doctor attending to Elias' injuries, explanations and statements given as twilight deepened into night. It emerged that Lillian's absence from town on her wedding day had alarmed the church ladies, who had alerted the sheriff. Finding the ransacked ranch and following the trail had led the lawmen to the mine just in time. Later, as Elias sat on the edge of a wagon while the doctor bandaged his ribs, he reached for Lillian's hand. "You could have been killed," he said hoarsely. "So could you," she countered, her fingers gripping his tightly. "I never thought," he shook his head, wincing at the movement. "I never expected you to come after me like that." Lillian knelt beside him, her eyes level with his. "Then you underestimated how much I love you," she said simply, "just as Thomas underestimated me all along." Elias' battered face softened with wonder. "I will never make that mistake," he promised. The sheriff approached, his expression grave. "Burke's being taken to the county jail. He'll face charges of kidnapping and attempted murder. His father's already on his way from Dallas, threatening to bring in lawyers." "Let him," Elias said wearily. "We have witnesses and evidence, and my brother will be here next week." The sheriff nodded, then added with a hint of a smile, "Seems to me you two still have a wedding to attend. Though you might want to postpone it a few days, given the circumstances." Lillian looked at Elias, his face bruised, his clothes torn and bloodied, his eyes shining with love and pride as he gazed at her, and knew with sudden clarity that no perfect ceremony could mean more than what they had already proven to each other. "Actually," she said, "if Reverend Gardner is willing, I'd like to be married tomorrow, right where we planned." Elias' smile was answer enough. Their wedding took place the following afternoon, delayed by 24 hours but otherwise exactly as planned. Elias stood at the altar with visible bruises but unbowed spirit, his brother newly arrived from Tennessee at his side as best man. Lillian wore her simple white dress with a crown of spring wildflowers in her hair, her face radiant as Mrs. Henderson walked her down the aisle in place of the father she had lost so long ago. The entire town turned out, the recent drama having transformed the couple from subjects of gossip to objects of admiration. Even Mr. Winslow closed the store for the occasion, his financial troubles temporarily set aside in celebration of love triumphant over adversity. When Reverend Gardner pronounced them husband and wife, Elias kissed Lillian with a tenderness that belied his injuries, his hands gentle on her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And for the first time in her life, Lillian allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was. The reception at the general store lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than the small town had seen at one gathering in years. As twilight settled over Sweetwater, Elias led his bride to the waiting wagon that would take them home to the Circle K, their home now together. "Are you happy?" he asked as they drove away, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Lillian leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting lightly over his heart. "Happier than I ever believed possible," she replied truthfully. "Are you?" "I came west thinking I needed nothing and no one," he said, his arm tightening around her. "Now I know that true strength isn't found in standing alone, it's found in standing together." As the stars emerged above the Texas plains, Lillian Kelly Kincaid closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude. The girl who had believed herself unlovable had found not just love but a partnership of equals, a home not made of timber and nails but of trust and courage and shared dreams. And as the years passed, that foundation proved stronger than any storm the frontier could send their way. The Circle K flourished, expanding into one of the most prosperous ranches in the county. Children came, first a son with Elias' hazel eyes and quiet determination, then twin daughters with Lillian's golden hair and compassionate hearts. Thomas Burke served 5 years in prison before his father's influence secured his release, but by then he had lost all power to harm them. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where they had once shared awkward conversations and tentative dreams, Elias presented Lillian with a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," he urged, just as he had with the locket so many years before. Inside, in Elias' careful handwriting, was the title. "The Cowboy's Love Story with the Woman Who Thought She Was Unlovable." "You wrote our story," Lillian said, tears gathering in her eyes as she leafed through pages filled with memories. Their first meeting during the storm, the barn fire, the church social, the mine rescue, and countless small moments of everyday love in between. "I wrote the beginning," Elias corrected gently. "We're still writing the middle, and the end, God willing, is many chapters away." As the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of promise, Lillian kissed her husband with the same wonder she had felt on their wedding day. "It's a good story," she whispered against his lips. "The best I know," he agreed, holding her close as darkness softly fell and another day of their shared life came to its gentle close.